Okay, this is the presentation I gave at RailsConf. I'm Rob Kaufman. I work at Mingle. My blog, where you can find these slides, is lightningtree.net. You can also find it up on the RailsConf wiki. So, what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about importing large data sets and exporting large data sets. It would be really awesome if we could just say to the banks and financial institutions we deal with, hey, we have this beautiful RESTful interface and you want to talk to us, you have to talk to us to that. And they'd pretty much just tell us to blow off because they really don't care because we're a little company and, you know. So, but there are a lot of other people out there that have to deal with companies that don't care whether, you know, you want to do things the easy way, or have set kind of parameters and procedures for doing these things, and that's the way it's done. And big organizations, if you're kind of sneaking Rails in, you got to put up with whatever it is that's the gold standard for where you're at. So those are the kinds of things that these tools will help you with. Techniques. Some of the techniques that I've found to be really useful and kind of help ease some of this pain is couple your import and export. This does a couple things. First of all, for almost anything you're writing, one or the other, you're going to eventually want the opposite. So you might as well put it in from the beginning. And I get really tired, I don't know about you guys, about importing my data into all these web services and never being able to get it back out. So I think it'd be really cool if more people would just go ahead and do it right the first time. The other thing this does is this allows you to do your integration testing. You know, if a set of data goes into your system, it should come back out looking the same, and vice versa. And if you can't do that, then you're not done yet. The other thing I found that's really important, especially when you're working with third-party partners, is use format samples. Yes, the 20-page Excel spreadsheet specification that they sent you is really nice and pretty and takes up a lot of paper if you print it out. But when you have an actual example of it looks like this, it's so much easier to talk about. And if you do that right off the bat, you're not going to spend, you know, an hour or two coding up something only to send it over and it's, oh no, that's not at all what we had in mind. And again, this helps you with your testing because you're going to need examples and samples to test against. So, you know, if it's agreed upon from the get-go and that's what you're testing against, you're going to end up golden at the end of the day. Another thing that I've learned kind of painfully is do handshakes. You want confirmation of success or failure as soon as possible. So, for instance, if you're sending a CSV file over FTP, you want to know how many records were successfully uploaded and which ones failed right away, even if they're then going to spend a week processing them before they give you anything that resembles results. That way, you're failing early and you're not, you know, for instance, in my business, a week means losing customers. So if they get caught in the system somewhere and don't get pushed through, we're not going to close those deals. They're going to have closed with somebody else, a different company, and that's lost money. So you want to really think about those kinds of constraints and try and get that information as fast as you can. The other thing a handshake really helps you with is I found that a lot of partners and a lot of people out there do what I like to call manualmation. That's an automated process with several manual steps. Symptoms of this include when someone takes a day off, the process doesn't happen. Or you notice that, you know, your date column is year, month, day, except during like Christmas break, where it's then day, month, year, or, you know, it switches back and forth throughout the file. You're gonna get ugly data and you're gonna have ugly data in your database sometimes. There are gonna be places where your validations are missed. And by doing a handshake, you're gonna be able to see those things and go in and try and fix them. One of the things I ran into pretty early on was, especially for one-off things, I started putting it in a rake file called the deflector dish. Because, whenever Kirk and Spock are in trouble, they reconfigure the deflector dish, and that's how they save the day. So, but I didn't have any way to test those rake tasks. And some of those rake tasks had gotten relatively substantial. So, I looked at examples of how do you do unit testing on your rake tasks. I forgot to say something earlier. One of the things about this presentation, there are a lot of relatively detailed code examples. I'm going to talk about the highlights on them, and then they're up on the web so you can see them if you need those tools. And I'm not going to go line by line through all this code because it wouldn't really be productive, I don't think. But I didn't see any examples of how to unit test your rake tasks, except that rake itself comes with a complete unit test suite. So looking at that, I figured out and have started using this methodology basically to test my rake tasks. And that's been a really powerful tool, especially for doing, I do a lot of my current take on background tasks is to do them in cron. And if you can separate them out into a rake job, then running them in cron is a lot easier. Another tool you'll find a lot of use for is faster CSV. Faster CSV is not only good for CSV files. Any character delimited file can be parsed by faster CSV. That's not really readily apparent the first time you look at the documentation, but pipe delimited, tab delimited, carriage return delimited, all of the various, character delimited file formats can be parsed by faster CSV. There's a CSV library built into Ruby. Faster CSV, well, it really is faster, and on a big file, it's substantially faster. It can often parse in one pass-through what CSV parses in 3. So you can kind of see how that cost savings is going to add up once you get up past, 100,000, 200,000 records. And it also gives you some nice syntactic sugar to get a handle on your various columns. So one of the cool things you can do here is you can very quickly take objects and send them out to CSV. And you can when you do that, you can just set the column separator and the row separator to anything you want. The second example here shows a dot separated format, which is obviously a really bad idea, but I know there's people out there doing it. And it also uses a Windows line feed for the rows, which can be important if you want to talk to Excel. The second example shows that if you happen to have a header row in your CSV that is the correct names for your columns, you can create objects very, very quickly. If you just tell the row to hash and then make all the keys for that hash symbols, and you have a really nice param-like structure that goes right into your objects. One thing I got some questions on earlier, I'll just clarify right now, is create with the exclamation point throws an exception if it fails to create, so it'll stop parsing the file at that point. If you're going to do that, you want to then catch that exception down at the bottom and put it in some sort of reporting file so that you can go through and find the 5 rows that were messed up in your 10,000 line import. Or do a rollback, but even that seems a little excessive, especially for a big data set. NetSFTP. If you're doing communication over SFTP, then NetSFTP is the way to go. It's a great Ruby library. It's NetSSH with the SFTP protocol implemented on top of it, just like SSH has the SFTP protocol implemented on top of it. The Ruby bindings for that, the way of interacting with it, were built kind of in the same order. And So some of NetSFTP feels more like SSH communication than it probably needs to. For instance, the starting of a session and the handling of directories seems to be substantially more complicated than the bare minimum requirement would have to be. It's more like the protocol and less like how you'd want to use it. As a library, this is the first in a series of libraries that I'm going to talk about that could really use some love, that haven't been very actively maintained, and that if someone out there is looking for a project to kind of get their feet wet and contribute to the community, there's some really great opportunities buried in here. If you're not fortunate enough to do SFTP, then you're looking at probably doing FTP. There is a tremendous amount of data transported over plain old, open, no security FTP every day. And as scary as that is, it means that you have the even scarier task of doing some form of encryption on your files before you send them, or decryption on the other end. Or if you're on a local intranet and it is, secured, then you can just use the NetFTP library. Now this is built into Ruby. There's no extra install. You do have to require it, because it isn't loaded by default. It's not a core library. It's just part of the standard library distribution. Logging in via FTP, NetFTP is very much like just using FTP on the command line. The command names are the same. It works pretty much the same. The order of everything's the same. It's all just basically right there for you. OpenURI is really cool. It's basically an abstraction of multiple different protocols. Namely, originally FTP and HTTP. It's just for getting and sending files. It only implements GET and POST in HTTP. And the problem is, there is an implementation of it for NetSFTP, which would then let you have FTP and SFTP with the same command set, and that'd be really awesome, right? But it's completely broken and has been for some time. It doesn't work at all. It needs a complete rewrite. So I can save you anyone trying to who sees that code and is like, oh, this is really cool. Its unit tests don't even pass. So I can kind of save you guys the hour and a half I spent trying to make it work. And the other problem with it is it doesn't handle directory listings at all. So unless you know the name of the file you're getting, you're kind of out of luck. So, if you have that one little niche that it fills, it's a super easy way to go. Curb. Curb is Ruby bindings for libcurl. I use it when I don't want to load up all of Rails. A lot of times in like a rake task or in something that's running like as a daemon, you don't want the 22 megabyte overhead of loading the Rails framework plus however much overhead your application is, to just, do one little query and then you're out. Or to hit one URL and then you're out. If you're doing Pgp encryption, then you're looking at two possible routes. One is to do GPG on the command line, which is using backquotes. You're gonna have a lot of headaches doing that. It's gonna break randomly. There are gonna be times when it doesn't work. And if you're doing anything that's threaded, you're just completely out of luck. Because escaping out to the shell is pretty problematic in that regard. There is a library for doing it programmatically called GPGME. GPGME are C bindings for the GPG programmatic library. So there's the GPG command line, and then there's GPGME, which is a programmatic API for that command line tool. And then Ruby GPGME is the Ruby bindings to the C bindings to GPGME. the current version of Ruby GPGME only works against GPGME 0.13.14 and lower. GPG is on like 1.7. So a lot of package management utilities aren't going to have an old enough version for you anymore. So you're out to compiling the source. Luckily for me, the guys that maintain Portage apparently believe in legacy. But once you do get it compiled, it works really well for the task. It's a lot faster than going out to the command line, and it's a lot more robust. However, it is pretty complicated, and there are some pretty serious bugs. My example code escapes to C at one point because the function's broken, and I wanted to use the stock library. I really strongly believe that this is something that can be brought up to date reasonably painlessly. Maybe a couple man days to get it done. I just don't have a couple man days to do it right now. So maybe someday I'll take up that torch. But if somebody beats me to it, I'll definitely buy you a beer. This is what the GPGME encryption looks like. I basically ended up going to the code itself and reading through the entire library and getting a thorough understanding of it before I could do this. The examples were basically useless. They only handled the absolute most trivial case. One of the things that this does that I found is important with Rails, because you're starting and stopping your app, and the state of your you're basically stateless, is you end up loading the key every time from the key file. The cached version is not sufficient. Decryption, again, reasonably pretty complicated, but at least there's a reasonably thorough example of how you could really do it. So let's talk about background tasks. You don't want to be the victim of manualmation, and you don't want to be causing that harm on someone else either. You want to really automate your stuff so that you don't have to think about it every morning. There are 4 real options right now for running background tasks. Background DRB has a lot of potential. It no longer works on Windows. It used to. The timed scheduled background tasks is relatively new, and there hasn't been a lot of code activity on it in the last few months. Ezra, I'm not even going to try and butcher his last name, spent a lot of time on it early on, but he's been busy with Engine Yard and some other things, and just hasn't gotten any time to dev on it. And the other maintainer is knee-deep in some project and isn't really working on it right now. So the timed background tasks are still pretty experimental. RailsConf is deprecated. The maintainer is done with it, decided it didn't work. For reasonably simple cases, it's dead easy to use, and really robust, and it's platform independent, which is pretty cool. But once you start getting some more complicated examples, it can be problematic. And if you're running like 10 mongrel processes that are all doing background tasks and queuing up stuff all the time, you're going to run into threading issues with RailsConf. Good old Unix cron is my current favorite. The amount of testing that's gone into cron and the number of people using it is huge. Most of your cron implementations haven't seen a release in 5 years. Not because no one's using it, but because there just isn't anything to do. It's a pretty well understood technology. It's easy to monitor on your production server. There's monit tasks or whatever your server monitoring is. If you're using Nagios, whatever, it's probably got the ability to watch a cron task and make sure that it's running properly. There's also Daemon Generator. Daemon Generator is the follow-up solution to RailsCron. by the same author. It basically makes it easy to generate a background process. It doesn't handle timing. It doesn't handle what that background process is going to do. It just kind of gives you a little template for what a background process might look like. So it's very, very bare bones, and you're pretty much on your own as far as dealing with scheduling, setting up a sleep, any of that stuff you got to do on your own. So now that I've talked about some tools and techniques, I'm going to talk about some possible approaches to handling this kind of job. One possibility is put everything in the model. This lets you use Script Runner, because Script Runner doesn't have access to the controllers at all. It makes it easy to unit test. You can use Script Runner. You can break out functionality into modules that you can put in your lib directory. This helps you kind of modularize that a little bit, because it can get pretty gnarly, especially as it gets more complicated, because it's all in one place. The bad is that it makes your model even more complex, especially as we're moving in general to a RESTful design and trying to implement RESTful practices. Your controller gets slimmer and your models get fatter. So putting even more functionality down in the model is just going to make that code much more complex to grok. You have to keep your jobs from running on top of each other. For instance, if you're running a background job and it takes 10 minutes to complete and you have it running every 5 minutes, things are going to go really ugly. You can set up some logic to keep that from happening, but then it's going to be skipping times. So you're kind of, you have to deal with that situation consciously. The other thing is Script Runner will instantiate all of Rails every time. Most of the time that overhead's probably not a big deal, but it's a lot of overhead. You're instantiating the entire framework into memory, you're doing your one thing, and then you're destroying it all. And then you're doing it again. And if you're doing that, once every hour or once a day, then that's probably alright. If you're doing, 8 or 9 background jobs that run on 5-minute intervals, and then 3 or 4 that run on half-hour intervals, you're gonna have to dedicate an entire server to it, and even then you're gonna run into resource issues. Another possible approach would be to separate the application into, for a separate application to do import and export. So say, okay, well, Rails is beautiful and it runs my web app and everything, but I'm just going to require Active Record here separately and build an individual application. It does a really good job of encapsulating that import and export. However, you end up building your own framework, which is one of the things we're all desperate to avoid. Because though it's kind of fun to build your own framework, after a while you have to maintain your own framework, and that's not anywhere near as much fun. And you get to reinvent the wheel yet again. So, tossing everything into rake tasks, it makes it easy to test. Once you set up rake testing, you can do cron or apt for those of you who are Windows administrators. But you're still instantiating all of Rails with every test run, or with every run. And your error reporting is a challenge to set up. You have to really be very conscious of it, and you have to set up some way of, for instance, if you have I can't even think of the name of the plugin. There's a plugin that emails you whenever your app throws an exception. These aren't going to get emailed to you. So, you have to set up a specific functionality to email yourself to give some alert of some kind on exceptions. So what do I think? This is what I would propose. Import and export should go in the model in 2x and from x. This gives you that nice unit testing ability. It is about the business data, and as that business logic changes, your import and export should change. So if you're in there adding columns or removing columns from the model, it's a good time to think about, hey, do I need to change what I'm sending out to people? Interfacing to partners in your controllers in a RESTful way. This means that you're doing the kinds of things you do normally It means if someday you can con whoever it is, the powers that be, into getting a nice RESTful interface going, then, I envision someday one of my partners calling up, hey, we've got this really cool, RESTful, we think we're really getting into this methodology. How long do you think it would take to get your side looking like that? I would say, oh man, that's going to be really hard work. Okay, it's done. Your background tasks and file transfer can go in Rake. There are two ways of kind of dealing with this. You can either use curb to kind of hit that, basically to hit the controller and get your file from the Rails app. That's really light. Your instantiation time is almost negligible. Your memory footprint is really tiny. You can set up a mongrel process. Like if you're doing a lot of this, you can set up your single mongrel process that isn't part of your load balancer. So now your technology is the same, everything's the same, but there's one mongrel that doesn't talk to the internet. It just talks to your background processes. Another possibility is as it matures, Active Resource will be able to take this role, and you can load just Active Resource instead of all of Rails, which is a little heavier than curb, gives you really beautiful syntactic sugar, and a very familiar feel. That's it. Be happy to answer any questions. If you do your rake tasks via cron, like if you're launching them via cron, when they error, they spit out to std out, and almost all cron implementations will either put that in a log file or email it to, wherever it's configured to email it to. So you can set it up so that cron will just send you your nice little stack trace like you're used to, with whatever went wrong if something does go wrong. If you're running basically because you're running them as separate background processes using whatever, at the same thing. At will email the administrator, and I think it logs to the event log whenever a process spits to std error, which is what happens when a rake job fails. Okay. I wanted to go off on something completely separate for just a second.
One last question.
Sure.
I noticed you took a lot of care in encrypting things and also using SFTP instead of FTP.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering why you didn't choose to use the web server itself to do the encryption and certificates and that sort of thing.
Wasn't an option.
It wasn't an option.
Yeah, most of the basically, with a couple of our partners, everything is over FTP. And with one or two of our partners, everything was over FTP and there wasn't any encryption involved. And my particular data sets include social security numbers, so that wasn't particularly acceptable. But the kind of the standard that you see the most often in my particular industry is PGP encrypted over FTP. And it's, like I said, it's a situation where you either play in their playground or you don't. I'm not sure what you're asking. The web server itself can generate a GPG encrypted file. The Rails application itself can generate it using GPGME, the library. You can't just make a transfer over SSL because FTP doesn't support SSL transfer. Without it becomes, there's another name for it. It is not just plain FTP anymore. It's not on port 21 like all the other FTP processes are.
Maybe we can delay this till later.
Sure.
I want to talk a little bit more about
Okay. And with SFTP, then you don't have to encrypt the files individually. The whole pipe's encrypted, and that's a better way to go if you can. But a lot of it was utilizing the technology that existed. They have an FTP server or an SFTP server set up. That's what they're used to communicating on. That's what they're willing to accept. And they're not, especially I find that the places with the bigger IT departments are less accommodating. So, the other thing I wanted to show you guys that I've been kind of playing around with lately, and I don't know, I think it's really cool how small a program it turned out to be, is we have a coworker who moved to Norway, and in order to kind of make him still feel included in the office, we set up a Mac Mini with a webcam and a monitor so that he kind of just comes to work still at his desk. And I had on my desk a USB powered missile launcher. I don't know if any of you guys have seen it, but it's a really cool toy for like $30 or $40. But you know, the novelty wears out. You can only shoot your coworkers so many times without getting in trouble. So I wrote a camping app that, and we'll see if this is going to work. It's going to be a question of whether I can get it on the VPN or not. But I wrote a camping app. It's 33 lines of code, and it controls the USB missile launcher. So you can go to a website, and you have little controls, and we basically zip-tied the camera to the top of the USB missile launcher, and it turns, and it pans, and it moves around, and the VPN line is not going to let me in, Matt. Yeah, nope, it's not going to let me in. Alright. Now, bummer. But it uses a really cool technology called RB AppScript. And what RB AppScript allows you to do is you can write AppleScript programs in Ruby. So all of the nifty OS X automation that can be done in AppleScript, you can do from your nice, comfortable language that you spend all your time in or whatever anyway, and in a more programmatic fashion without trying to figure out where the 4 goes, or the 2 goes, or... and AppleScript's a pretty good language. I'm not trying to diss it in any way, but basically, RB AppScript lets you just... anything you can do with AppleScript, you can then do with Ruby on a Mac. And that makes for some pretty cool task automation. It is... I don't think it's the same. This is relatively complete. There's a Python bridge that is very, very complete. It's a total complete implementation of everything AppleScript can do, Python can do. And the Ruby implementation is just a port of that, and so it's pretty solid. And there's some nice tools. There's a tool that lets you put in AppleScript, and it spits out the Ruby scripts. So it'll just do the translation right there for you, and then you can put it in your code. So it's kind of a fun tool that I've been playing with the last couple days. All right. Yes, substantially. You're not... in Ruby OSA, you're talking AppleScript in quotes in a Ruby program. Which is a place to start, right? But you're not talking Ruby at all. So you can't do a for loop the way you would in Ruby. You have to do it the way you would in OS X, or in AppleScript. You can't do, any of the closures that in the blocks that are so cool and powerful and make us all happy. So but with the RB AppScript you can, and that I think is just really awesome. Mostly because whenever I program in 2 languages, I start to get them really confused, and so the more I can stay in one place, the less I put semicolons on the end of my lines unnecessarily, and all the other random things that seem to happen when I start trying to program in too many languages at once. So that's it. I'm sorry, what was that?
Put the double equal signs in for compares, forgetting to put those in once in a while.
Yeah.
Can't right away either.
I did entire page of code a couple days back, and I was overtired. I'll admit it. But I look at it, and I was writing JavaScript, and I had all of the for loops were Ruby for loops, with the dot each and everything. But then they had curly brackets just like they would if they were JavaScript, and all of this
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.